call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Days get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions, an opportunity to journey with this incredible book, which is known as the Book of the Judges. It is an amazing book, and as we've already pointed out, quite a controversial book in many ways. It introduces themes to us that we may well find quite disturbing. We're going to continue to journey today by looking at perhaps one of the more likable stories, at least initially contained within the Book of Judges. And of course, that's the story of Gideon. Gideon makes great reading up to a certain point for us. We're going to concentrate in this session on Judges chapter 6 and the initial call and commissioning of Gideon to engage with the Midianites and the Amalekites and the other nations that had formed this oppressive alliance at this particular time. We're going to be introduced to someone in the person of Gideon that is really a person who we try and keep in a good light and enjoy the incredible story that surrounds this amazing victory that he is able to lead the people in. But also, as we go along, we'll find, as with all the judges, that he too is very vulnerable and prone to making mistakes. So let's begin to engage with chapter 6. And again, this evening, I've invited David Suchet to do the reading for us.
Judges chapter 6. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Gideon replied, If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, The Lord is Peace. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night the Lord said to him, Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. In the morning, when the people of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished, with the Asherah pole beside it cut down and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, Who did this? When they carefully investigated, they were told, Gideon, son of Joash, did it. The people of the town demanded of Joash, Bring out your son. He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal that day, saying, Let Baal contend with him. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. Gideon said to God, If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. Then Gideon said to God, Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry, and let the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew.
Well, I guess as you've listened to David read in that particular chapter 6 of Judges, you will recognize instantly that same cycle that we've been made aware of time and time again in the early chapters of Judges. The Israelites do evil in the sight of the Lord, and of course that results in them being subject to oppression. This time, of course, the Midianites who carry out these destructive raids into the tribal areas that are occupied by the people of Israel. The forces that come against them are very destructive. And so what happens is that the Israelite tribes, the communities that had been established and settled in the land, retreat. They try to find somewhere where they can hide away, perhaps somewhere where they're not so vulnerable to these raids that are being carried out. So they tend to head towards the hills and the mountains. Probably there they hope that they're able to store their food safely and to avoid these raiding parties. And it's a strong alliance that has been shaped and formed to come against these tribes of Israel. I think what we see here is I suppose in one sense it's almost like a scorched earth policy that you may well be familiar with. That oppressive regimes, oppressive nations, governments often carry out against those that they consider to be their enemies. They're trying to deny these tribes who have settled in their land as they perceive it. They're trying to starve them out, to move them on. And so it's not a case of carrying out raids that bring back lots of grain and wheat and wine and all of those things that nations embraced at that time. It's actually just to bring about total destruction, to deprive them of the basics of life within the nation in which they have settled. And of course, to do that, they carry out these raids, they destroy the crops, they destroy animals, and it's a very destructive program that is set against these tribal groups that we would describe as Israel at this time. And of course, that leads on to that moment of utter poverty and utter desperation. And in their utter poverty and utter devastation and desperation, the people cry out once more to the Lord for help. What we find here is somewhat different to what we've already seen in the earlier chapters of Judges in terms of the people crying out. There's no sense of an immediate deliverer being found and enabled to carry out this very act of deliverance and salvation for the people, the tribal groups that made up Israel at that time. Instead, we find that initially a prophet is sent by God. It's a reminder that as things are spiraling downwards, that each time God is responding in a slightly different way. And of course, the prophetic voice is one that faces people with the reality of their situation and calls them to recognize that it's their own fault that this has occurred in the first place. And so what we find here is that God dispatches this prophet to raise an awareness of what is behind all that is happening and to call his people to accountability, which of course is very much the Old Testament prophetic role. The prophet begins by reminding the people that God had brought about their liberation, their freedom. He had overcome their oppressors, and he had begun that process of settling them into the land that he had promised to their forefathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So God is pictured as the one who is proven to be absolutely faithful to his covenant commitments. The reverse, of course, is true of the people of Israel, these tribal groups loosely knitted together into what we might describe as the people of Israel. Though they viewed it very differently, they thought the problem was with God. It was his fault that things were so bad for them, that God was failing in his covenant promises, whereas the prophet reminds them in reality, the problem is theirs. They have failed in their covenant commitments to God. And it's ironic that the people should twist that truth and put all the blame on God. And in a moment, we'll see when we're firstly introduced to Gideon, how Gideon holds clearly that particular view, that particular standpoint. So it's not God's fault, it's their fault. They had been warned time and time again, and they had ignored the warnings. And the result is that their covenant commitments were failing, and of course would ultimately be destroyed, just like their crops and their livestock were being destroyed. So God speaks to them through a prophetic voice. And then secondly, we're told that God speaks through an angel. At least that's what we perceive this angelic being to be. There's some overtones here that this may be much more than an angel, but that's open to question. Let's stick with the idea that this is an angelic messenger dispatched from the very throne of God. Well, of course, if Deborah had been commissioned straight away, what we find here is that this is going to take Gideon 2 visits. Again, it's a reflection that because the situation is becoming worse, God is having to deal with his people and manage the situation and bring about deliverance in a very different kind of way. So the angel arrives to find Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press. In other words, hid away so that the Midianites wouldn't see what Gideon was up to. The greeting, the somewhat surprising greeting from the angel, I think can be understood on a number of different levels. It could be that the angelic messenger is gently teasing Gideon. It could be that the angelic messenger sees the potential within Gideon that, of course, Gideon doesn't see within himself. Or it could be that the angel admires the courage of Gideon to find a hiding place and to carry on the process of threshing the wheat. Because, of course, if he's caught, he will be killed. So there could be any number of different ideas and thoughts and thinking behind this greeting, and it would be interesting for you to kind of wrestle with that in your own right. You do have to admire, though, the courage of Gideon. He could have avoided doing this, but he has made that stand in that sense. Gideon responds to the angelic messenger by bringing what we can only describe as a complaint. Complaint is not an unusual feature in the Old Testament. In fact, it would appear that Scripture encourages us at times to bring our complaints before God. Well, of course, Gideon's complaint is a reflection of what these tribal groups that made up Israel really felt was true. That it was God who had abandoned them, that this was all God's fault. It's interesting that the angelic messenger doesn't respond to that complaint at that moment, and instead commissions and assures Gideon that God is going to be with him as he goes and takes on this lead role in bringing about the deliverance from this terrible oppression and injustice carried out by the Midianites, that God will be there and he will enable Gideon to fulfill this particular role, this particular calling. It's interesting at this point to note that the beneficiaries of what will happen in terms of ridding the land of the Midianites and the Amalekites and the other nations that were involved in this alliance of oppression is that the benefits of it will be felt for all Israelites, whether or not they were true to God, whether or not they were faithfully individually keeping their covenant commitments, whoever they were going to benefit from what God was about to do. It's a powerful reminder of what is known as common grace, God's grace that is universal and experienced and shared by everyone on the planet. Naturally, Gideon, like so many individuals within the Old Testament and into the New Testament, feels totally inadequate as far as this task is concerned. Notice how the angel's title begins to change. Suddenly it becomes Lord, which is why some believe that this was much more than just an angel. But the angel assures, or the Lord assures Gideon, that this is going to be a partnership, that together God, the Lord, and Gideon are going to bring down the Midianites. Of course, as you go through these words and the conversation that takes place, it's very reminiscent of the conversation and the calling of Moses. And then later on, of course, Isaiah. And I think the author is doing that deliberately to make those connections because both, of course, Moses' story and the story of Isaiah at that time were stories of liberation and the overcoming of oppressors. The narrative now begins to move on into a passage, I guess, that challenges our thinking about what it means to test the Lord, to test God. If we go back in Scripture, particularly to Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16, you find these words, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test, as you did at Massah." And of course, Jesus later on confirmed that to be the case in his confrontation with Satan during the temptations, where he says to Satan, you know, I will not test the Lord my God. So we see that dynamic opened up through Scripture. So what is happening here? Is Gideon testing God, or is it something else? Well, of course, the response of the people of Israel that we find in Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16 is framed within rebellion and disobedience. It doesn't appear at this point that Gideon is rebellious, nor is he being disobedient. He just needs reassurance. After all, of course, what's being asked of Gideon is that he's going to put his life in danger. And it's at that point, quite obviously, that Gideon needs that sense of reassurance. He wants to know that what he's hearing is not just some kind of voice in his head, some unusual form of imagination, but that this is actually the Lord speaking to him. This is confirmed through an act of worship. A sacrifice is made, and of course fire was a sign at that time, and continued to be right through into the New Testament, that the sacrifice was acceptable to God. So suddenly Gideon is made aware that the voice that he's been listening to, the figure that has stood before him, is a reality, that this is God's messenger, possibly even more, God himself, who has come to speak with Gideon. Quite naturally at that point, he panics. He thinks, I'm done for, because to see God is to die. But the angel, the angelic messenger, however we want to define the presence there, assures him that all is going to be well. And so he does what is a tradition at that time. He marks the place of remembrance by the building of an altar. The genuine nature of Gideon's questioning, I think, is clearly shown by his actions. They do say, of course, actions speak louder than words. Because when he goes back or goes into his own village, he knows he has to do something. And he's not courageous enough at this point to do it in daylight, for he still fears the men of his village. So he decides to take action during the night. He tears down the altar to Baal, and he uses the material in the construction of an altar to God, to Yahweh, the true God of Israel. And then again, he cuts down the Ashereth pole. Now, of course, all of that was to put your life in danger. And when the men of the village gather in the morning and see what has happened, they're furious and they want to know who's done it. Well, it's Gideon, who's soon disclosed as being the one who has carried out this deed. And of course, the men are ready to kill him. Thankfully, at this point, Gideon has a very wise father who argues that if Baal is a god, then let Baal sort it out. He can get his own revenge on Gideon. He doesn't need you, the men of the village, to do that for him. And of course, the protective wisdom of his father enables Gideon to survive this very dangerous and life-threatening moment. Something that I guess Gideon will remember for a very long time, because of course at this point he's renamed Jerub-Baal. Let Baal contend with him. The final and last section of this particular chapter, Judges chapter 6, introduces us to an important phrase that we're going to see time and time again in the book of Judges, and of course later on throughout the pages of the Old Testament. And that's this moment when Gideon is filled with the Spirit of the Lord. It reminds us that although Gideon, as we will see, is very human, he's needed lots and lots of reassurance and will need more reassurance. The Spirit of God comes upon him to enable him to fulfill this particular task. The armies of the Midianites and the Amalekites and the other nations that form this alliance gather once more. That's the scene that the author is laying before us, wants us to picture. And of course, the threat now is imminent. Another raid is about to take place. And so perhaps in that moment, Gideon just needs that sense of confirmation, that moment of reassurance once more. He's looking now the enemy in the face. He knows that they're nearby. And he just needs to be reassured, as I guess most of us would, that this is the right thing. And of course, he does that by utilizing this fleece. It's as if the author is inviting us again to realize that God uses the most vulnerable and the most unpredictable people the least likely to carry out the most enormous tasks on his behalf. People with vulnerabilities and uncertainties are not written off by God, but actually will be used by God to achieve his purposes. We've seen that already, and we're seeing it now as we enter into Judges chapter 7.